Hey everyone, Keanu Murray here. Today I'm going to show you how to use barriers in Fortnite Creative. We'll also go over the uses of barriers, how to set them up, and I'll show you examples of how I've used them in some of my creative maps. There's two kinds of barrier device, the barrier plate and the plane barrier. We'll be going with the plane barrier device. You can find this by going to Devices, then on the left-hand side scroll down to Volume. We want to use the plane barrier device because we can place it anywhere and rotate it if we want, which can't be done with the barrier plate. Once the barrier is placed, we can edit the settings. We can change the way the barrier looks in barrier style. There are several options here, including invisible, pure black, and even several outer space themes. When you have the style set as invisible, no one will be able to see it. While you're editing your map, the barrier will be outlined in orange lines, but those lines won't be visible during gameplay. The base is this little yellow circle we see at the bottom of the barrier. When we set the base to invisible during game, no one will be able to see the base, which is usually what we want as the base is just there for us when making the map. We can set the barrier width, depth, and height to change the shape of our barrier to fit our needs. We can make the barrier tall so players can't jump over it, or long so they can't walk around it. We can tell the game which phase we want the barrier to be active in, and if the barrier will block weapon fire or not. We also have the option of a box or hollow box. A hollow box is a barrier players can stand inside that will keep them in. A box is a barrier players stand outside that will keep them on one side of the barrier. We can also make our barrier turn on and off during gameplay by setting it to enable when receiving from a channel or disable when receiving from a channel. Let's set up a trigger to disable our barrier during gameplay. We're going to tell our trigger, when triggered, transmit on channel 1. Then we'll tell our barrier to disable when receiving from channel 1. Now we can test it by starting the game. Our barrier is enabled. When we step on the trigger, it sends out a channel 1 signal. The barrier receives the channel 1 signal and disables. Sometimes we may want the player to disable the barrier temporarily, but we want the barrier to go back up. We can set up a second trigger or button to enable the barrier again. We'll set this trigger to channel 2 and set the barrier to enable when receiving from 2. Now that we have multiple triggers, we'll let our players know that one turns the barrier on and one turns it off. Now when we walk on the off trigger, the barrier disables. When we step on the on trigger, the barrier enables again. Now that we know some of the basics of barriers, let's see a few things they can be used for. Here I've set up a mini death run type game. When the player spawns in, I want them to go through the game area and not step outside of it. Invisible barriers keep the player in, and low walls help indicate to the player where they should be. Now our player has come to a barrier and needs to drop it before they can continue. To do that, they pick up a can and hit the fish stick head. Now the barrier is gone. Once on the other side, the barrier enables again. Now there's an invisible barrier and text to tell the player to hit the switch to drop it. For the final barrier, the player must hit all 3 switches, and again we have text to tell the player what they need to do. Now I'll show you how we set this up. We can see our invisible barriers placed to keep players only where we want them. Notice these barriers are only 0.05 wide to make them easier to place only where we need them. In this area, we have an item spawner to give us our can, and a trigger in front of Fishstick's head. When the can hits the trigger, it sends a signal to drop the barrier. On the other side of the barrier is another trigger, which sends a signal to raise the barrier. This means players who come after me will still have to drop the barrier. Now we have a simple switch. When the state of the switch changes, it transmits on channel 3. This barrier is set to disable on 3. I also have the text set to disable on channel 3 so the player knows the barrier has dropped, since this barrier is invisible. For the final stage in this mini run, the player has to press 3 buttons. It's only an illusion that they're pressing 3 buttons to drop one barrier. In reality, there are 3 barriers, each placed right behind each other, and 3 text clues telling the player what to do. One text clue and barrier is set to turn off when receiving from channel 5. Another clue and barrier turn off when receiving from channel 6, and the final text and barrier turn off when receiving from channel 7. The 3 buttons send out signals on either 5, 6, or 7. Barriers can also be used as something for players to walk on. We can also use barriers to make interesting environments. For this map, I've placed large flat barriers on all 4 sides of the map as well as at the top and bottom of the map and set them all to look like a nebula. This creates a seamless outer space environment for this spaceship and the players to live in. On the bridge of this ship, I've placed a barrier and set it to look like a sci-fi force field. A player can run into the bridge and turn the force field on and stay safe from players outside. Players outside can hack in by pushing a button and drop the force field. This is just one of many interesting ways to use barriers during gameplay. The final thing we'll look at is the use of barriers in one of my death runs. This death run has players going through a forest into a Halloween festival. I used barriers to keep players where they should be and prevent them from running around obstacles instead of completing them. When we fly above the map, you can see just how many barriers were used. This is only possible because we used the barrier device and not the plate barrier device. I can copy, paste, and rotate the barrier device as I need to for dynamic placement. It's also helpful that I can make these barriers 0.05 wide, so they're nice and thin and don't take up too much space. Keep in mind you can also resize these barriers by grabbing them and then resizing as opposed to going into the settings. Let me know in a comment what creative tutorial you want me to make next.